I thought I was dying in the rain. Not in some dramatic way. Not with sirens or flashing lights. Just me, alone on a dark sidewalk at nearly midnight, with cold water pouring from the sky and my lungs refusing to work. The rain hit the pavement in steady sheets, loud enough to swallow the sound of the city, and every breath I tried to take felt smaller than the last. My chest tightened. My hands started shaking. I knew the feeling too well. Panic attacks don't ask permission. They don't care where you are. One second you're standing there trying to hold yourself together, and the next your body decides it's had enough. I tried to walk faster, hoping I could reach the corner store 2 blocks away. The neon sign was barely visible through the rain, glowing red in the distance like some small promise of light. 40 yards. Maybe less. But my legs felt heavy, like someone had filled my shoes with concrete. My vision blurred around the edges. The streetlights smeared into long golden lines. I pressed my hand against a brick wall, trying to steady myself. Just breathe, I whispered to no one. But the air wouldn't come. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my ribs. The rain soaked through my jacket, through my shirt, straight to my skin, cold enough to make my teeth chatter. Cars passed at the far end of the street, their headlights sweeping across puddles, but none slowed down. No one noticed the girl standing there fighting for air. That's the strange thing about cities. Millions of people everywhere. And somehow you can still feel completely invisible. My knees started to buckle. I slid down the wall, the rough bricks scraping softly against my sleeve as I sank toward the wet sidewalk. The rain ran down my hair and into my eyes, mixing with tears I didn't even realize had started. I tried one more deep breath. Nothing. Just a tight, hollow feeling in my chest. My fingers curled against the pavement as the world tilted sideways. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the low hum of an engine pulling closer, tires rolling slowly through the rain. A black car stopped a few feet away from where I had collapsed. The door opened. I couldn't see the man clearly through the storm, but I remember the first detail that registered before my vision disappeared completely. Polished black shoes stepping onto the wet asphalt. They stopped right beside me, and then everything went black. I woke up to warmth. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the light, not the room. Warmth. My body was wrapped in thick blankets that smelled faintly like clean cotton and something deeper, something expensive and unfamiliar. For a moment I did not move. My mind felt slow, like it was trying to climb through fog. The last thing I remembered was the rain, the cold pavement, the feeling that my lungs had stopped working. I blinked slowly and stared at the ceiling above me. It was high and perfectly white, with soft recessed lights glowing along the edges like quiet stars. This was not my apartment. My place had cracked paint and a ceiling fan that rattled every time it spun. I pushed myself up a few inches, my muscles heavy, and the mattress sank beneath me like I was lying on a cloud. A king bed, maybe larger. The sheets were smooth and cool against my skin, the kind you only see in luxury hotels. My heart skipped once. Panic tried to rise again, but this time it was different. Slower. Controlled. I turned my head carefully. The room around me was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the far wall, revealing a skyline full of glowing buildings and distant traffic lights. Rain still traced thin lines down the glass, but the storm had softened into a quiet drizzle. The city looked smaller from up here. Higher than 20 floors, maybe more. My breath caught when I realized I was not alone. A man stood near the windows, his back turned slightly toward me. Tall. Still. One hand rested casually in the pocket of a dark coat that looked tailored perfectly to his frame. The city lights reflected faintly along the glass beside him, outlining the sharp line of his shoulders. He had the kind of posture that filled a room without trying. He did not rush toward me when I moved. He did not even turn right away. For several seconds the only sound was the rain tapping softly against the glass and the slow rhythm of my breathing returning to normal. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, low, steady in a way that made the large room feel suddenly smaller. He said that I should not sit up too fast. He said that panic attacks can make the body feel weak for a while. The fact that he knew that sent a strange chill through me. I pulled the blanket slightly closer around my shoulders and finally forced myself to ask where I was. The man turned then. Slowly. The first thing I noticed was his eyes. Dark, observant, completely unreadable. Not cold exactly. Just controlled. like someone who measured every reaction before allowing it to show. His hair was damp at the edges, as if he had been out in the rain earlier. He looked at me for a moment, studying my face as if confirming something important. Then he answered in the simplest way possible. He said that I was safe. He said that I had collapsed in the rain about 30 minutes earlier. He said that bringing me here had been faster than waiting for an ambulance in the storm. My mind tried to catch up with the information. Safe. Here. A penthouse above the city. With a stranger who spoke like everything in the world moved according to his quiet decisions. I glanced again at the massive room, the polished floors, the subtle gold light reflecting off dark furniture that probably cost more than my yearly rent. Nothing about this place felt ordinary. I looked back at him and asked the question that suddenly mattered more than anything else. Who are you? For the first time, a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not warm, not unfriendly, just knowing. He stepped a little closer to the bed, close enough for the city lights to reveal the quiet confidence in his expression. And then he said his name. Adrian Vance. I repeated the name silently in my head. Adrian Vance. Something about it felt familiar in a distant, unsettling way, like hearing a song you could not quite place. I watched him carefully while my mind tried to sort through the fog of the last hour. He stood only a few feet from the bed now, close enough that I could see the small details I had missed before. The precise cut of his coat, the calm way he carried himself, the kind of quiet confidence that does not need to prove anything. People like him did not live in places like my neighborhood. People like him did not stop their cars for strangers collapsed in the rain. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and glanced down at myself. My clothes were gone. For a split second, panic sparked again in my chest before I realized what had replaced them. A soft gray shirt that clearly did not belong to me hung loosely over my arms. The fabric was warm and clean, several sizes too large. Whoever had changed my clothes had done it carefully, respectfully. My shoes sat neatly near the side of the bed, dried and placed together as if someone had taken time to make sure they were not left on the wet floor. I looked back up at him. Adrian Vance was watching me with the same quiet focus, as if every small reaction mattered. I asked him how long I had been here. He said just under an hour. His voice stayed even, calm in a way that made the room feel controlled. I asked why he brought me here instead of a hospital. For the first time, he shifted his gaze slightly toward the rain sliding down the window behind him. He said that panic attacks can become worse in crowded emergency rooms. Too many lights. Too many people. Too much noise. He said I needed quiet. The strange part was that he sounded like someone who understood exactly how panic felt. That thought lingered in my mind longer than I expected. I looked around the room again, noticing details I had missed before. A dark wooden desk near the far wall. A row of books arranged with perfect symmetry. A glass table beside the bed holding a bottle of water and a small white pill container that had not been opened. Everything about the place looked precise, organized, controlled, nothing out of place. I swung my legs slowly over the side of the bed and placed my feet on the floor. The polished wood was cool beneath my toes. Adrian watched the movement but did not step closer. He simply said that I should take my time, that the dizziness might return if I stood too quickly. I nodded without realizing it. My body still felt heavy, but the tightness in my chest had finally loosened. I took a careful breath. Then another. The air felt normal again. That alone felt like a small miracle. I stood up slowly, steadying myself on the edge of the bed. The room did not spin. My balance held. Adrian studied me for a moment and then reached for the glass of water on the table beside me. He handed it over without stepping into my space. His movements were deliberate, controlled, like someone who had learned long ago not to rush anything. I took the glass and drank half of it before realizing how thirsty I was. When I lowered it, the quiet between us returned. But this time it felt heavier. My mind circled back to the question that had been forming since he first spoke his name. I looked up at him again. I asked what he was doing driving through a nearly empty street in the middle of a storm at midnight. Adrian Vance did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the door behind him. And that was when I heard it. A voice outside in the hallway. Low. Respectful. The door opened slightly, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped into view. He stopped the moment he saw me standing beside the bed. His posture straightened instantly. His eyes shifted toward Adrian. And the first word out of his mouth was not Mr. Vance. It was boss. I froze when I heard the word. Boss. The man in the doorway had said it automatically, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Not sir. Not Mr. Vance. Boss. The room suddenly felt different. Heavier. Like I had stepped into a reality I did not fully understand yet. The man in the suit looked about 30, tall and broad-shouldered, with the alert posture of someone used to standing guard. The moment he realized I was standing beside the bed, his eyes widened for half a second before he quickly lowered his gaze toward Adrian. It was not fear exactly. It was respect. The kind that comes from knowing exactly who is in charge of the room. Adrian did not look surprised by the interruption. He simply turned his head slightly toward the door. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable, but there was something in the air between the two men that spoke louder than words. Authority. Quiet and absolute. The man in the doorway cleared his throat and said that he did not realize Adrian was occupied. His voice was careful, measured, like every word had to pass through permission before leaving his mouth. Adrian replied that it was fine. His tone was steady, neither welcoming nor dismissive, just controlled. The man nodded once and stepped fully into the room. His shoes made almost no sound against the polished floor. That was when he glanced at me again. This time curiosity flickered briefly across his face before discipline pulled it away. He looked back at Adrian and said that the car had been taken care of and the driver was waiting downstairs if needed. Adrian acknowledged the message with a small nod. No long conversation. No questions. Just a quiet exchange that sounded like routine. But something about the moment confirmed the uneasy thought forming in my mind. This was not just a wealthy man with a nice penthouse. This was someone people organized themselves around. Someone whose decisions moved others without effort. I felt suddenly aware of the oversized shirt I was wearing and the fact that I was standing barefoot in the middle of a room that probably belonged in a magazine. I cleared my throat softly and asked the question that had been pressing against the inside of my thoughts since that single word left the guard's mouth. I asked if he was really their boss. Adrian looked at me then, fully this time. His dark eyes studied my face as if measuring how much I had already figured out. The guard shifted slightly by the door, clearly unsure whether he should stay or leave. Adrian lifted one hand in a small gesture toward him. The man understood immediately and stepped back into the hallway, closing the door behind him without another word. The quiet returned, thicker now. Adrian walked a few steps toward the window again, his hands resting loosely at his sides. For a moment, he looked out at the city below, where the rain continued to fall in thin silver lines under the streetlights. When he finally spoke again, his voice was calm but direct. He said that people call him many things depending on what they need from him. Some call him Mr. Vance. Some call him Adrian. Others prefer the word I had just heard. He turned slightly, meeting my eyes again with that steady, unreadable expression. Then, he said something that made my heart beat just a little faster. He said that titles do not matter tonight. What matters is that I collapsed in the rain and he happened to be the one who stopped. I opened my mouth to respond, but hesitated. Because the strange truth sitting between us was simple and impossible to ignore. In a city full of strangers who drove past without looking twice, the man people called boss had been the one who carried me out of the storm. I stood there holding the empty glass of water, trying to understand how my night had turned into this strange moment high above the city. Adrian Vance watched the rain outside as if the entire skyline belonged to him, and the quiet confidence in the way he carried himself made it impossible to ignore what the guard had called him. Boss. The word echoed in my mind louder than I wanted it to. I had lived in this city my entire life, but suddenly it felt like I had stepped into a part of it I had never seen before. I cleared my throat softly and set the glass back on the table beside the bed. My voice sounded smaller than I expected when I finally spoke. I said thank you for helping me. The words felt simple, but they were the only honest thing I could think of. Adrian turned his head slightly toward me again. His expression did not change much, but I noticed something different in his eyes this time. Not distance, not curiosity, something closer to quiet acknowledgement. He nodded once, as if gratitude was not something he expected to hear very often. Then he asked a question that caught me off guard. He asked if the panic attacks happened often. I hesitated for a moment before answering. There is something about the way certain people speak that makes it difficult to lie. I admitted that it had happened before. Not every day, not even every week, but enough that I knew the signs when my chest started tightening in the rain. Adrian listened without interrupting. His posture remained relaxed, one shoulder leaning lightly against the edge of the window frame, while the city lights reflected across the glass behind him. When I finished explaining, he said something that surprised me even more. He said that panic can feel like drowning even when you are standing on dry ground. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of someone who understood the feeling from experience. I looked at him differently after that. Until that moment, he had seemed untouchable, like the kind of man who moved through the world without anything ever shaking him. Hearing him describe panic that way cracked that image slightly. I asked him how he knew what it felt like. Adrian did not answer right away. Instead, he looked out over the city again, where the rain continued to soften the glow of the streetlights below. After a few seconds, he simply said that everyone carries storms people cannot see. The way he said it made the room fall silent again. My eyes drifted around the penthouse once more. Everything about this place suggested power and control. Yet the man standing in front of the window spoke like someone who had learned something difficult about life a long time ago. I shifted my weight slightly, suddenly aware that I probably should not stay here much longer. This was not my world. I was a girl who worked long hours at a small bookstore downtown and counted every dollar at the end of the month. I did not belong in penthouses where guards waited in hallways and strangers called the owner boss. I took a careful breath and said that I should probably go home. Adrian looked back at me immediately. His gaze moved briefly toward the rain sliding down the glass, and then toward the door behind me. For the first time since I woke up, something like concern appeared in his expression. He said that the storm had not fully passed yet, and that the streets would still be cold and wet. Then he added something that made the quiet in the room deepen again. He said that his driver could take me home. But before I could respond, his phone on the table near the window began to vibrate softly. Adrian glanced at the screen, and for the first time since I had met him, the calm expression on his face shifted slightly, as if the message he had just received mattered more than anything else in the room. I watched the faint glow of Adrian's phone screen reflect across the glass table near the window. The vibration stopped after a few seconds, but he did not look away immediately. Something in his posture changed, subtle but unmistakable, like a man who had just been reminded that the quiet moment in this room did not belong to him for long. He picked up the phone slowly and glanced at the message. His expression remained controlled, but the calm atmosphere around us shifted slightly. Not tense, just focused, like a switch had quietly flipped somewhere behind his eyes. He typed a short reply with steady movements and set the phone back down without explaining what the message was about. I did not ask. Somehow it felt like stepping across an invisible line. Instead, I looked down at the oversized shirt hanging around my arms, and then toward the rain outside the window. The storm had softened even more now. The steady downpour from earlier had faded into scattered drops sliding down the glass. Far below, the streets reflected the lights of passing cars in long silver streaks. The city looked peaceful from this height, like all the noise and chaos had been washed away by the storm. Adrian walked back toward the center of the room, his footsteps quiet against the polished floor. He stopped a few feet away from me and studied my face for a moment, as if checking whether the panic from earlier had returned. When he spoke, his voice carried the same calm weight as before. He said that his driver was already downstairs and that the car would take me anywhere I needed to go. The way he said it made it sound less like an offer and more like a simple fact. I nodded slowly, grateful but also strangely hesitant. Leaving meant returning to my small apartment, my narrow streets, my ordinary life where nothing unusual ever happened. Yet standing here in this enormous penthouse beside a man people called boss felt just as unreal. I slipped my feet back into my shoes and tied the laces carefully, giving myself a moment to steady my thoughts. Adrian watched without rushing me. The quiet between us felt different now. Not uncomfortable, just aware. When I stood up straight again, he reached for a folded dark coat resting over the back of a chair nearby. It was clearly his. The fabric looked heavy and warm, the kind designed for cold nights and long drives through storms. He held it out toward me without saying anything. I hesitated at first. Accepting it felt strangely personal, like taking something that belonged in his world into mine. But the memory of the cold rain from earlier returned to my skin, and I finally slipped the coat over my shoulders. It was far too large, the sleeves nearly covering my hands, but it carried a quiet warmth that immediately chased away the lingering chill in my bones. Adrian nodded slightly, satisfied that I was no longer shivering. He moved toward the door and opened it with a smooth motion. The same tall guard from earlier stood in the hallway. His posture straightened instantly when he saw Adrian step out. Adrian spoke only a few quiet words that I could not fully hear, but the guard nodded once and reached for a small radio on his jacket. Within seconds, the hallway outside the penthouse seemed to come alive with quiet movement. Doors opening. Soft footsteps. People responding quickly without raising their voices. I stood in the doorway watching the scene unfold, realizing that the man who had carried me out of the rain commanded an entire unseen world that moved the moment he spoke. Adrian turned back toward me then, his expression returning to that calm, unreadable look I was starting to recognize. He gestured gently toward the elevator at the end of the hallway and said that the car would be ready by the time we reached the lobby. I took one step forward beside him, still trying to process the strange path this night had taken. Because only an hour ago I had been alone on a wet sidewalk fighting for air. And now I was walking through a silent penthouse corridor beside a man the entire building seemed to orbit around. I followed Adrian down the quiet hallway, the oversized coat wrapped around my shoulders and the soft sound of our footsteps echoing against the polished floor. The building felt different from the moment we stepped out of the penthouse. It was silent, but not empty. People were there. You could feel it. Subtle movement behind closed doors. The faint murmur of radios somewhere out of sight. The guard from earlier walked a few steps ahead of us, speaking quietly into the device clipped near his collar. Every few seconds he nodded as if someone on the other end was answering. Immediately, it was the kind of efficiency you only see in places where everyone knows exactly who they are working for. I tried not to stare too much, but it was impossible not to notice how the hallway lights reflected off the marble walls and the dark framed artwork spaced perfectly along the corridor. This building was not just expensive. It was designed to impress anyone who walked through it. When we reached the elevator, the guard pressed the call button before I even had time to look for it. The metal doors slid open almost instantly, revealing a spacious interior lined with brushed steel and soft lighting along the ceiling. Adrian stepped inside first, then turned slightly to hold the door while I followed. The guard remained outside. As soon as we were inside, the doors closed quietly and the elevator began its smooth descent. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I watched the floor numbers above the door change one by one while the faint hum of the elevator motor filled the silence. The coat around my shoulders still carried the subtle scent of rain and something deeper, something like cedar or smoke. I wondered how many places Adrian had walked through wearing it before tonight. Finally, I glanced toward him. He stood beside me with the same calm posture he seemed to carry everywhere, one hand resting loosely in the pocket of his coat, while his eyes followed the numbers above the door. I realized something then. The entire time I had been in that penthouse, he had never asked my name. It was such a strange detail that I almost laughed quietly to myself. Here I was riding down a private elevator with a man who seemed to control half the building, and we still did not know the simplest thing about each other. I cleared my throat and told him my name was Lily Carter. Adrian turned his head slightly toward me when I said it. For a moment, he studied my face again with that thoughtful expression I had started to recognize. Then he repeated my name once, slowly, as if committing it to memory. The sound of it in his voice felt oddly significant, like something small had just been placed into a much larger story. The elevator continued moving downward through the tower. Somewhere far below, the city waited with wet streets and glowing traffic lights reflecting off the pavement. Adrian finally spoke again, his voice quiet but clear in the enclosed space. He said that Lily Carter was a name he did not expect to hear tonight. I smiled faintly and said that passing out on sidewalks had not been part of my plans either. For the first time since I met him, something close to amusement touched the corner of his expression. The elevator slowed gently as it reached the lower floors. The doors began to open, revealing the bright marble lobby beyond. A black sedan waited outside the glass entrance under the covered driveway, its headlights glowing softly against the damp street. As the doors finished sliding apart, Adrian looked toward the car and then back at me. And in that quiet moment before we stepped out into the lobby, he said something that made my heart pause for a second. He said that the strange thing about cities is that millions of people pass each other every day without their stories ever touching. Then he added that sometimes one small moment in the rain is enough to change that forever. The elevator doors opened fully, and the quiet hum of the lobby replaced the soft mechanical sound behind us. The space was wide and bright, filled with polished marble floors that reflected the warm lights hanging from the ceiling. Even at this hour, the building did not feel empty. A man stood behind the reception desk near the far wall, and the moment he noticed Adrian stepping out of the elevator, his posture straightened immediately. He did not say anything, but the recognition in his eyes was obvious. Adrian walked forward at an easy pace, and I stayed close beside him, still trying to absorb how natural this entire world seemed to him. Outside the tall glass doors, the rain had almost stopped. Only thin drops tapped softly against the pavement under the covered driveway. The black sedan I had seen from the elevator waited quietly near the curb, its headlights reflecting across the wet street like pale ribbons of light. The driver stepped out the moment he saw Adrian approaching. He closed the umbrella he had been holding and opened the rear door of the car with practiced precision. Everything happened quickly but without chaos, like a silent routine that had been repeated many times before. I slowed slightly as we reached the entrance. The cool air from outside drifted into the lobby when the doors opened, carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt. Adrian stopped beside the car and turned toward me. The street behind him stretched into the distance, glowing with the reflections of traffic lights and wet pavement. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The strange quiet between us returned, the same kind that had followed us since the penthouse. I slipped my hands deeper into the sleeves of his coat, still surprised by how warm it felt. Then I realized something else. If I stepped into that car now, the night would simply end. I would go back to my small apartment, return the coat later somehow, and this entire experience would turn into one of those stories people tell their friends because it sounds too strange to be real. Adrian seemed to sense the hesitation in my expression. His eyes studied my face again with that calm attention that made it feel like he noticed more than he said. He told the driver to take me wherever I needed to go. The driver nodded once and waited patiently beside the open door. I took a step closer to the car, but paused before getting inside. Something pulled my attention back toward Adrian. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the quiet sense that this night had not finished unfolding yet. I asked him a simple question. I asked if he always stopped for strangers in the rain. Adrian looked at me for a moment, and the faintest hint of a smile appeared in his expression again. Not a large smile, just enough to change the sharp lines of his face. He said no. Then he added that tonight had been different. I waited for him to explain, but he did not continue right away. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the dark street where his car had first stopped earlier that night. When he looked back at me, his voice lowered slightly, as if the memory had followed him all the way here. He said that when he lifted me from the sidewalk, I had grabbed the front of his coat with surprising strength. I felt my face warm with embarrassment immediately. I could not remember doing that at all. Adrian continued calmly. He said that before I lost consciousness completely, I whispered something to him. My heart skipped once as I asked what I had said. Adrian held my gaze for a quiet second before answering. He said that I looked at him like he was the only person left in the world and whispered 3 words. Please do not leave. For a moment, the city noise outside the building seemed to disappear. The headlights of the waiting car glowed against the wet pavement, and the faint sound of rain tapping on the sidewalk filled the quiet space between us. Please do not leave. The words echoed in my mind in a way that made my chest tighten again, but this time it was not panic. It was embarrassment mixed with disbelief. I shook my head slightly, trying to remember that moment on the sidewalk, but everything after the panic attack had been a blur of rain and darkness. The idea that I had grabbed a complete stranger and whispered something like that felt unreal. I looked down at the sleeves of Adrian's coat covering my hands and let out a quiet breath. I told him I was sorry if I had caused trouble. Adrian's expression did not change much when I said that. He simply watched me with the same steady attention he had shown all night. Then he said something that surprised me again. He said that it was not trouble. He said that most people in this city pretend they do not need anyone. They keep walking even when someone else is struggling a few feet away. He paused for a moment and glanced toward the wet street beyond the driveway. Then he looked back at me and said that hearing those 3 words had been honest in a way the world rarely is. I did not know how to respond to that. The driver still stood beside the open door of the sedan, waiting patiently, as if time moved differently around Adrian Vance. The lobby lights reflected softly across the polished floor behind us, and the quiet night stretched out like a blank page waiting to be written. I realized then that my hands were still tucked into the sleeves of his coat. Slowly I pulled them free and slipped the coat from my shoulders. The cool air touched my arms again immediately, but I held the coat carefully and offered it back to him. Adrian did not take it right away. For a moment he looked at the coat, then back at me. Finally he shook his head once. He said I should keep it for the ride home, because the air would still be cold outside. The simple kindness of the gesture caught me off guard more than anything else that had happened tonight. I nodded quietly and slipped the coat back on. The driver gently gestured toward the car again, reminding me without words that it was time to leave. I took one step toward the open door, but stopped before getting inside. Something inside me wanted to say one more thing before the night ended. I turned back toward Adrian. The soft glow of the lobby lights framed his silhouette against the glass doors behind him, and for the first time I noticed how still he stood while the rest of the world moved around him. I thanked him again, not just for the ride or the coat, but for stopping when everyone else had driven past. Adrian gave a small nod, the same quiet acknowledgement he had shown earlier. Then he said something that stayed with me long after that night ended. He said that sometimes the smallest moments decide which stories cross paths in a city this large. I stepped into the car slowly, the leather seat warm beneath me as the driver closed the door. Through the window, I could still see Adrian standing under the covered entrance, calm and unmoving while the rain traced thin lines down the glass doors behind him. The car began to pull away from the curb, and the building slowly faded into the distance. I thought the night was over. I thought I would return to my normal life, and that Adrian Vance would disappear back into the world he belonged to. But as the car turned onto the wet street, I noticed something unexpected in the side mirror. Another black vehicle pulling out behind us, keeping a quiet distance in the rain. And somehow, without anyone needing to explain it, I knew that the story between me and the man who stopped in the storm had not ended yet.